Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here and joining us for the second segment of the Black History Month program. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you to today's inaugural State of Black Kentucky event. My name is Representative George Brown, and I represent District 77 in Lexington, and I am the chair of the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus. I was going to say something, but he doesn't find it funny for me to say something, so I won't say funny because Gerald Neal pulled my coat. This event marks part two of our annual Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus celebration, a program that takes place each year right here in the Kentucky State Capitol. And let me just remind you all, this is your house, okay? This is the house of the people, so you all are always welcome. You don't need to have a special event to come. You can always come here. We are excited that we continue to provide this space for important dialogue. The Kentucky History Celebration begins each year in the Rotunda of the State Capitol in February. The Rotunda is the symbolic center of government, representing the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches. It is a symbolic statement expressing that Black history is American history, indeed Kentucky history. KBLC, in part, is pleased to expand on this reality in exploring where we have come from, where we are, and what does it take to get there. Again, thank you. Now I'm moderator and vice chair of today's event, KBLC Vice Chair, Senator Gerald Neal.
Thank you, Representative Brown, and good morning. It's truly my pleasure to welcome you as well today and to this inaugural State of Black Kentucky. I want to repeat that, inaugural State of Black Kentucky. And I want you to understand that what we're doing here is really something that we believe is going to bode well for the future in terms of educating, leveraging information and facts and validating information as opposed to the information that floats around that people actually build policy off of that's not real, that's made up. So what we're talking about is pulling people together here. I think we've done that today, and you'll see individuals that know what they're talking about, that are committed to research, data-driven conclusions, or at least support it. This year's event will shine a spotlight on critical areas of health, education, economics, justice, and equity. 4 pillars that are essential to the well-being and advancement of all populations. And when I say all, that includes the Black population. Today's event is an opportunity for us to present and initiate an annual data-driven analysis that highlights the current status, the progress, and ongoing challenges of the Black community in Kentucky. In keeping with the theme this year's celebrations, understanding the past, facing the future. This isn't just about looking back. It's about understanding where we stand today, both in comparison to other groups, as well as how far we've come since the beginning and the opportunities to take advantage of in facing the future. What have our practices done, are doing, and can do? The data and insights we'll share today are designed to provide policymakers, researchers, community leaders, and all Kentuckians an informed foundation for taking action. By examining relevant aspects of race, ethnicity, economic class, and more, we aim to provide a clear picture that will drive beneficial, real-world solutions to improve outcomes for all Kentuckians. I want to read that again, but I have a feeling you know what I'm saying. This event is more than just a presentation. It's what I'm trying to say. It's a call to action, one that challenges us all to work together, to create meaningful change for our communities. And as an aside, I must indicate that we're living in a familiar space right now for those who are students of history. We are clearly in a period of reaction, and a lot of that reaction is just ideologically grounded on thin platforms, or none at all, made up. So we want to get down to data-driven pieces out of this. I hope today's discussions and findings will serve as a national basis for the kind of policy reforms that will ultimately improve the lives of all Kentuckians, especially those who have been historically underserved. So I'm excited. Our presenters today will give presentations from a panel for questions and dialogue and offer you an opportunity to inquire as well. So they will give a presentation. We will ask questions. We will have discussions. We'll delve into this, and we'll see where it goes. What I want you to keep in mind is that this is not just a presentation. This is the beginning of an annual process that ultimately, annually, will produce reports based upon investigation, research, and development of papers that are validated, which serves all that make policy. And that's what's important about meeting here. We're right here in one of the highest chambers of developing policy. So symbolically, this is significant having it right here in this chamber. So I'm delighted to have here today four guests. I'm going to start with Dr. Anastasia Kerwood, who is here to my left, is a Hallam Professor of History and the Director of the Commonwealth Institute for Black Studies at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Kerwood's academic studies include a focus on the struggles of 20th century African American women and their impact on electoral politics. Would you please greet Dr. Kerwood? And by the way, if you look in your program, you'll see more information I'm providing here. Dr. Joseph Benitez is a health economist who also a faculty member of the University of Kentucky. Dr. Benitez's focus includes studies of Medicare and Medicaid and the impact these programs have on addressing poverty. Would you please greet Dr. Benitez? Then we have Dr. Natasha Desjardins. She hails from the University of Louisville. As a former Deputy Director for Environmental Justice at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, Dr. Desjardins brings a perspective which focuses on health disparities and environment. Would you please welcome Dr. Desjardins? And of course, last but not least, Dr. Roger Cleveland has a broad background as an educator, community leader, and researcher in the fields of diversity, equity, cultural humility, and academic innovation, a national name. Would you please welcome Dr. Cleveland? As I've indicated, we will begin with a presentation by Dr. Kerwood. Dr. Kerwood.
Good morning. It is wonderful to see you all here and to have the opportunity in Black History Month to explain the consequences of Black history and the relevance of Black history. Black history is U.S. history, Black history is Kentucky history, but also U.S. history is Black history. Kentucky history is Black history. You cannot understand where we've been and where we're going without Black history. And so this is a very appropriate moment in which to discuss the consequences of Black history. And I've been asked to give some context and some historical background so that my co-panelists are able to then explain where we are in three crucial areas. So I'm hoping that I can help you understand something more about where we've been as we think about where we are. And in particular, what I'm talking about for the next 10 minutes, and covering this whole topic in 10 minutes is impossible, so we'll have a good question and answer session together, as I hope. The question is, how did issues of equity and justice make an impact on Black Kentuckians? And how have Black Kentuckians influenced equity and justice in the Commonwealth, influenced ourselves? And I'm standing up here as the great-great-granddaughter of two Black Kentuckians who were enslaved here. I grew up somewhere else and only found out as I was moving here that I am a great-granddaughter of the state. The trick about Black history, or the catch about Black history, is that you have to hold the two things simultaneously. One of them is, frankly, violence and repression. We have histories of atrocities, human rights violations, not just civil rights, human rights violations, things that are unimaginable, things that have led to extreme trauma. And you also have to hold simultaneously the humanity of Black people, the resistance to that violence and repression, and the community that we have established. And so you consider both of those things at the same time whenever you're thinking about this history. Black Kentuckians have never been passive recipients of fate. Both injustice and success, brilliance, are the outcome. And the history of seeking and finding justice is our heritage, both in terms of where we find ourselves at the present moment and the tools we now have at our disposal. We can look to our ancestors for these tools. This history belongs to every Kentuckian. Everyone needs to know this. And it informs our decisions as we make them here through our elected representatives and in day-to-day policy and decisions. So what I'm going to do in the minutes I have left is call out 4 key moments in Kentucky's Black history. These moments exemplify the forces for equity and justice here in Kentucky, and I hope that everyone finds this to be valuable context. So the first moment I identify is slavery and emancipation. Sometimes we think of Kentucky as having been somehow less invested in slavery. Kinder, gentler slavery here in Kentucky. And with not so many slaves, so it doesn't matter so much. But if you look at the actual numbers, our enslaved population in 1830, so 35 years before emancipation, it was about 165,000 people, a quarter of the state's population. So a quarter of Kentuckians were enslaved. And in some counties, it's much higher. I live in Woodford County. Woodford County had the highest concentration of enslaved people. You wouldn't know that now. But that's how it was. In 1860, the percentage had gone down a little bit because of increased populations of other groups, but in 1860, there were 225,000, about 225,000 plus 500 enslaved people in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. That's about just under 20% of the population at the start of the Civil War in 1860. Remember, Kentucky did not ultimately join the Confederacy, at least not during the Civil War. We relied heavily on not just enslaved labor for our key crops. That's hemp, it's tobacco, corn as well, especially in the bluegrass region, especially in this golden triangle area. We also relied on the proceeds from the sale of those people. So it was not just so-called free labor or unpaid labor. It was also an amazing amount of wealth held in the bodies of those enslaved people. So you can imagine slavery died hard here, and it did. We had slavery until after the end of the Civil War, until December of 1865. That's almost 8 months after Appomattox Courthouse. So it died hard here, and finally the 13th Amendment eradicated slavery here, at least chattel and hereditary slavery. So in the midst of this, what did enslaved people do? Well, we know that historians have found extraordinary evidence of pushing for freedom. There's an enormous bottleneck. People are looking for avenues to freedom. And in the 1860s, that pushed the dam over. People started flocking to places like Camp Nelson and putting their bodies in places where the Union Army had to deal with folks, not just as enlisted soldiers, but women and children who came along as well. And they stayed there despite sometimes hostile treatment from the Union Army, from the supposed liberators. But these people kept pushing their case, and eventually the 13th Amendment had to be passed, because what are we going to do with Kentucky? The Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to Kentucky because it's not in the Confederacy. What do we do with Kentucky? We have to pass a constitutional amendment outlawing slavery. These people pushed that along by putting their bodies where we were not able to be missed. So I can say much more, but I'm going to move on to the second period that we need to consider, and that is the eras of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Reconstruction, because Kentucky was not in the Confederacy, we didn't have the same protections during Reconstruction that former Confederate states had. And then, after the end of Reconstruction, we had pretty much nothing. Folks who had been working land did not get a hold of any plots of that land in compensation or just because of what was right. So folks really had to build from scratch. There were fewer obstacles to voting than in other states. Alabama, Mississippi, we know. Those are very high barriers to voting and participation in electoral politics. However, everything else about Jim Crow, segregation, poverty, and what's upholding all of it, violence, all of those things were very much present here in Kentucky. So again, Kentucky does not have a kinder, gentler Jim Crow. There is no kind, gentle Jim Crow anywhere, least of all in Kentucky. For example, we had about 350 lynchings in Kentucky. There were instances of mob violence that did not result in murders. There are also what colleagues of mine have called legal lynchings, in which farcical kangaroo courts would convict people of crimes and immediately execute without due process, despite the 14th Amendment that entitled people to due process. So that violence then is upholding a climate of fear. But what are Black people doing in Kentucky at that time? Building mutual aid societies, building churches, building fraternities and sororities, building communities, excelling in the signature industries, in the horse industry, in bourbon, in hemp production. So this is a time in which Black people are continuing to build and are getting ready to push back. The third point I want us to consider in history is the late 20th century, specifically right around the classic civil rights movement. And it's really wonderful to be here because in 1964, 61 years ago, almost, we had our own march, the March on Frankfurt, led by Senator Neal's predecessor, Georgia Davis Powers, before her election as a grassroots activist in Louisville, and relying on allied organizations for civil rights. This is a group of grassroots organizations that had been patiently but determinedly building up strength, and that was transformed into political power when Powers was elected to the state Senate. So there's always the repression, as you're seeing, but then there's also pushing back and eventually pushing for that 1966 Civil Rights Act that banned segregation and discrimination inside the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So real legislative change. Now, the fourth period is now. We are in history ourselves. We are part of this next moment. And I like to tell my students, we're no smarter nor stupider than other people in history. We have the benefit of previous experience, but it is our choice whether to let that inform us and increase our knowledge and our capacity, or to just kind of blindly keep going and pretend that certain things haven't happened before. What we see now is, okay, so we don't have any segregation signs. There's no colored only, whites only signs. But what we do have is an incarceration rate that's 2 times the rate for white Kentuckians. So that's a pretty stark statistic. 3 times the rate of incarceration, 2 times the risk of police violence and of being killed by police. So we have these newer versions of some of the older disregard for not just civil rights, but human rights. So I want us to think about ourselves as a moment in history. It's not de jure segregation. It's not it's not debt peonage. We have fewer formal obstacles, and yet we still don't have economic equality. We still don't have health equality. Life is still precarious for Black Kentuckians today. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to the experts on what is going on at this moment. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I will also lead off by saying my only regret is following the amazing speech by Dr. Kerwood. A very supportive colleague and scholar. So once again, my name is Joe Benitez. I am a professor in the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration at UK. And I'm an economist by trade, but I also focus a lot in health policy and health inequality and understanding the economics of the the healthcare system. And for a lot of people, there can be a disconnect in like, okay, you study health, but you're also an economist. What does that actually mean? It's like, well, think about our most valuable resource, which is ourselves, our bodies, our ability to work. And if we think about our health as a key contributor to our ability to work and draw income and build capital, build resources, build wealth. And following along with Dr. Coolwood's speech, if there have been policies in place that have systematically kept people from opportunities or kept people from being able to invest in their health, then that's kind of where understanding what are the long-term effects of those policies. What does that actually mean? Disparities not only in access to high-quality hospitals, but disparities in access to health insurance, which in 2014, when in the first full year of the Affordable Care Act, to many known as Obamacare, Kentucky was the first state in the South, or as you say, like however Kentucky considers itself, the first Southern state to really embrace and expand Medicaid. And what that means is more people who are considered low income or more people who might have disparate access to health insurance coverage now have this main resource to afford health care. Now what happens when people can't afford health care? They have to make some serious choices about how they spend their money, and that could be whether they can afford their housing bills, whether they have to go through food insecurities, all because they have to make conscious decisions of whether I go to the doctor or do I eat or do I feed my family. So by expanding coverage out to more people and providing a resource that many people have benefited from, many of the things we've seen is not just more people going to the doctor, but reductions in medical debt, reductions in people being called by collections agencies. So these are all things that we might consider as economic outcomes that are extensions of our ability to protect ourselves from the burden of health expenses or even being able to address our health needs. Not only that, is the Medicaid expansion led to improvements in hospital financial viabilities. And we know that a lot of safety net hospitals, particularly serving low income and communities of color, are more likely to be financially vulnerable or more at risk of closure. And at least nationally, we know that the expansion led to improvements in hospital financial health and even protected many hospitals from closing their doors permanently or even being acquired by a for-profit agency, which could have changed access to healthcare in another way. In addition to providing opportunities for improved access to healthcare, it also changes some aspects of how people engage in work. So many people think of a pathway to economic viability as their ability to become self-employed or become an entrepreneur. But as we know, becoming an entrepreneur takes a lot of risk, and it can be otherwise expensive for a lot of people. And for a lot of people, not just people in this room, but people that are in your lives, people in your communities, a lot of the reason many people might be concerned about becoming an entrepreneur is still having access to healthcare. So still having the ability to go to the doctor when they need to, or when they're not sure if they need to in the future. So one of the things we've also seen, at least in some small aspects of the research, is that increases in entrepreneurship as people have more access to different types of coverage options, whether it's on Medicaid or even via the marketplace. So being able to purchase individual health insurance coverage plans. So some of the other things I wanted to make sure I highlight for you. So following the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a lot of income volatility. So we saw people experience reductions in income. We saw people lose health insurance coverage, which compared to many other states, even though Kentucky saw a rise in unemployment, which were even harder hit among Black communities in Kentucky as well as other communities of color, more people were still able to continue going to the doctor because of the access to Medicaid and other healthcare resources that help to stabilize the healthcare sector. At present now, the unemployment rate in Kentucky is about is 5.4%, which puts it higher than our neighbors, Tennessee, Indiana, in West Virginia, and even Ohio. But some of the things going on in West Virginia is there's some other issues going on in the market, a lot around finances, especially in higher ed. Now, the Black unemployment rate is generally higher in all of these states, particularly because of differences in access to opportunity, access to resources, or even access to even building wealth. Following the pandemic, there's been some fluctuations. At one point we've went back to our pre-pandemic or pre-COVID-19 pandemic unemployment rate, and then there's been some fluctuations since about summer of 22, where it's starting to creep back up again for both for the general population as well as for the population of Black Kentuckians. Some of the things that we still face nationally, but especially in Kentucky, are disparities in the income gap. Compared to many other states, and particularly because of even histories of legacy racism, legacy inequality, that there's still a large gap, especially in differences in opportunity coming out of Reconstruction, that still create income inequalities as well as wealth inequalities that persist today. One of the things that even coming out of Reconstruction, even though Kentucky was by and large not like many of the other Confederate states, it still was not devoid of the racism, even though, quote unquote, kinder Jim Crow still had these very hurtful policies that, even if it's not the physical lynching, where we all can create the vision in our minds of what that looks like, but lynching in other ways, or administratively keeping people away from opportunities that would allow them to invest in their health, but also invest in their wealth in the future. Public policies such as Medicaid expansion, and even policies to create and expand opportunities, are generally helpful in solving some of these long-term inequalities. And that requires some thought at both here in the Capitol and even within our communities, but also like leveraging outside resources, particularly those coming from the federal government. Long term, I would say there's, one of the key paths to building economic inequality is not devoid of thinking about how you think about addressing health inequality. So creating access to healthcare and stabilizing access to healthcare, and even protecting people from what can be potentially enormous out-of-pocket costs for healthcare can have positive side effects on other economic indicators. So that wraps up my spiel. So thank you so much for having me here today.
I am really grateful to have this time to share with you today. Thank you, Senator Neal, for the kind invitation. Definitely want to acknowledge my brothers and sisters in the NPHC, as well as my sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I'm Dr. Natasha D. Jarnett, and I come to you from Louisville, Kentucky. And I look forward to sharing about the state of Black health in Kentucky. So, the Constitution of the World Health Organization defines health as a complete the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And then they go on to say, it is the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, or economic or social condition. And they also say that the governments have a responsibility for the health of their people, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate health care and social measures. And this goes right in accordance with CDC's definition of health equity, which is health equity is the state in which everyone has a fair and just opportunity to attain the highest level of health. So for the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to hear from people in communities across the U.S., and they share heartfelt public comments about their health concerns in relation to environmental exposures. Among the most gripping was a woman who had just lost her son at a young age due to a rare cancer weeks before that call, and she believed it was due to hazardous air emissions in their community. Her son, unfortunately, did not attain his highest level of health. But that is our responsibility. Our health and well-being has to be prioritized. For without our health, there is nothing that we can do. So health is a human right. However, the differences in health outcomes demonstrate health disparities in African Americans in the U.S., including here in Kentucky. And these disparities reveal the interconnectedness of health, socioeconomic status, including education and employment, as well as the environments where we live, work, play, pray, and learn. So in the U.S., the top causes of death are heart disease, cancer, accidents, COVID-19, and stroke. Here in Kentucky, very similar for all of the above, with the exception that lower chronic respiratory diseases replaces stroke for Kentucky. But for Black Kentuckians, it's a little bit different. It's heart disease and cancer, as you've heard before, but it's also diabetes, asthma, and violence. So let's delve a little further into these for the state of Black health in Kentucky. To frame things, for the total population, according to the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, African Americans make up just 8% of Kentucky's population. Most of the Black population in the state lives in Jefferson and Fayette counties. And then consider life expectancy. Life expectancy is a key measure of overall health in a community. So the 2021 report of the Council for Health and Family Services, they report that Kentucky is 48th among the 50 states and District of Columbia with an overall life expectancy of 75.3. So we're towards the bottom when it comes to life expectancy nationally. Here in Kentucky, white women have a higher life expectancy than Black women, and white men have a higher life expectancy than Black men. Black men actually have the shortest life expectancy of all groups in Kentucky. Within this disparity, it's also important to know that place matters. So if you look at a map of Jefferson County or Louisville, Kentucky, in this map, you'll notice that the further east that you go, the longer life expectancy is. So there is a 12 to 15 year reported difference in life expectancy between West Louisville and East Louisville. Our life expectancy should not be determined by our zip code. Transitioning to cardiovascular disease. This is the top cause of death worldwide. It's also the most expensive disease, narrowly edging out cancer. Cardiovascular disease mortality rates for Black Kentuckians is 449 per 100,000 population, compared to 398 per 100,000 population for white Kentuckians. That means that not white Kentuckians, but the whole state. That means that 51 more Black people per 100,000 people are more likely to die from cardiovascular disease in Kentucky. Diabetes. We have a higher rate of diabetes in Kentucky than in the nation. The nation's rate is about 12%. In Kentucky, it's about 14%. But for Black Kentuckians, it's nearly 19% compared to about 14% for white Kentuckians. It's similar for prediabetes as well, 15% for African Americans and 12% for all adults in Kentucky. Transitioning to asthma. While asthma can affect anyone at any age, it's most common among Black Americans, and this trend also continues for Black Kentuckians. In Kentucky, nearly 14% of asthmatics are African American, and that's compared to 11% for whites. But when we look at asthma-related deaths, African Americans are twice as likely to die from asthma as compared to whites in Kentucky. And this is also important to discuss in the context of children. The prevalence for Black children in Kentucky is 13%, and that's compared to 7% for white children. So it's about 6% prevalence higher for Black children. Maternal mortality has gotten a lot of attention in the media lately, and rightfully so. And here in Kentucky, maternal mortality eclipses, for Black mothers, eclipses that of white moms, with nearly 50 per 100 live births, compared to 30 per 100 live births for white women. Also, infant mortality is significantly higher for Black Kentuckians than any other racial or demographic in Kentucky. For cancer mortality is higher for Kentucky than compared to the U.S. average as well. For African Americans, we experience higher rates in Kentucky compared to the nation for the following types of cancer: breast, prostate, lung and bronchus, colon and rectum, melanoma of the skin, pancreas, cervix, brain, myeloma, and uterine cancer. And we can't have a conversation about health without also talking about mental health. Suicides are actually lower for African Americans in Kentucky compared to our white counterparts. However, there are some emerging trends of concern that we should be aware of when we're considering the state of Black health in Kentucky, and that is that African Americans, based on a report from the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, they show that there is a trending rate of an increase in suicides among African Americans. There's also been reports of increased suicidal ideation among young Black males. And then there's also been a rise in young Black males seeking treatment in Kentucky. So many of the factors that I've just shared with you, there are additional factors that can highlight or that can mitigate these risks. And there are some individual factors like smoking or obesity. There are also access factors that have been shared by my colleagues, Dr. Benitez, in terms of health insurance, health care, also access to preventive services, and even access to nutritious foods. There's also socioeconomic status, education, unemployment, income, as we've discussed today as well. But I also bring this to your attention that there are also environmental exposure differences that are also related to our health outcomes. So each of the health impacts that I've shared with you today that disproportionately affect Black Kentuckians, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, asthma, maternal mortality, and mental health outcomes, interestingly, are all related to environmental exposures. And in particular, they are all related to climate change. So just as human health is a fundamental right, I share with you that we all deserve clean air to breathe, safe water to drink, access to healthy food, and communities that are free of environmental hazards. However, climate change threatens the quality of the air that we breathe and the water that we drink, and it hinders our ability to grow and access healthy foods that can leave destruction in our communities as well. So climate change is decreasing the quality of the air that we breathe. The extra trapped heat in the atmosphere is also reducing air quality. And air quality and extreme heat are linked with heart disease, asthma and allergy exacerbations, kidney disease, and adverse mental health outcomes. And Black or African American communities are uniquely burdened due to us living in closer proximity to hazardous polluters and also living in urban heat islands. Again, place matters. So I'll share with you a little story of my own. My grandparents' community was home to numerous steel mills, and some are actually still in the neighborhood today. Also, a major interstate runs right through their community. Another interstate is just south of the community. The airport is just south of their neighborhoods. And there are hazardous waste sites and so forth. There was documented soil contamination in their community that has been remediated. But the community continues to deal with poor air quality today, and there are a number of health disparities that are present day, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, asthma, and other chronic conditions, along with low life expectancy. So I recently discussed the story of visiting my grandparents' home in North Birmingham, Alabama, and my discovery that as a child, my asthma would flare up when I would visit their home. And I reasoned that that might be due to the poor air quality there. I shared this story with a reporter in Louisville, and in response, the reporter told me that their spouse grew up near Rubbertown in Louisville, Kentucky, and reasoned that that could be a factor for why their spouse had asthma as a child. I thought about it, and you're probably wondering, why were you talking to me about something in Birmingham, Alabama? We're talking about the state of health in Kentucky. When I thought about it, North Birmingham, Alabama equals Rubbertown in Louisville, Kentucky. Rubbertown was home to 11 to 13 rubber manufacturers. North Birmingham was home to numerous steel mills. Both are communities that are predominantly Black and brown. Both are communities that were formerly redlined, have airports nearby, have highways and major roadways that run through them, and both have Superfund sites or areas that required cleanup. So it's Birmingham. It's Louisville, Kentucky. There are numerous communities like this across the nation. In the 2022 Lancet Countdown on Climate and Health U.S. Policy Brief, my colleagues and I shared the following about the ways that communities of color are more susceptible to the health effects of climate change. Based on the existing research, we noted that the factors that influence our risk are closely related to disproportionate exposures. And I'll quote from the report. Systemically racist policies, including historic redlining, created segregated communities in which people of color disproportionately lived in neighborhoods burdened by hazardous environmental exposures, high heat, flooding, and less tree canopy. As such, urban heat islands are more likely to occur in Black and African American and Latino communities. Further, systemic disempowerment has contributed to communities of color being home to polluting facilities and comprising the majority of people that live in close proximity to a toxic facility, thereby heightening exposure to pollutants and increasing risk of toxin exposure during flood events. The Louisville Metro 2024 Health Equity Report notes that the consequence of the environmental crisis falls disproportionately on those countries and communities that have contributed least to the problem and are least able to mitigate the harms. But knowing that, we know that human health is a fundamental right. We also understand that from what I've shared today and from what you likely knew coming in, that it is challenged for Black Kentuckians due to health and environmental disparities, and these are inextricably linked. So I'll leave you with this. Climate change is real, it's happening now, it's affecting health today, it's inextricably linked with health equity, but there is much that we can do about it. And with that, I am happy to pass along to our next speaker, and I hope that we'll have opportunity to discuss some things that we can do about it. Thank you.
Good morning. First, I want to thank Senator Gerald Neal for the invitation. I also like to recognize any policymakers that are in the room, the broader community that's here, my Divine Nine family that's here, and particularly the Brothers of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. It's great to be here. My task today is to describe and explicate the status of Blacks in public education in Kentucky. But it's not to motivate you, to sway you or convince you, but to inform you of the state of Blacks in education. This task is both an honor and a responsibility to discuss an issue that is deeply significant to the future of Black people in the state of Kentucky, and quite frankly, the future of everyone in the Commonwealth. I will share past experiences, current realities of Black students in K-12, and post-secondary education systems. We can, whenever and however choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than what we need to do that. Whether or not we do it must finally depend on how we feel about the fact that we haven't so far. That was Dr. Ron Edmonds, who is considered the father of effective schools. He made this statement in 1979 in Brooklyn, New York. Almost 50 years ago, he was basically saying we have everything we need to do to educate children in public education. And the part that really caught my eye was when he said whether or not we do it must finally depend on how we feel about the fact that we haven't so far. Education is often called the great equalizer. Yet for too many black students, the system does not reflect that promise. Instead, historical and systemic barriers continue to shape their educational journey in the Commonwealth. Disparities, access to quality resources, representation, low achievement, and the reality of many are students. Since Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, black students collectively have struggled in public schools. We have seen some improvement, overall, but nationally and locally, black students still lag behind their white counterparts in public schools. But before I take a deeper dive into data, I want to say this, because there's going to be some data that's kind of alarming. Some of those who are educators is not alarming to us. We've been seeing this. But before I take a deep dive into data, I want to make this clear. There's nothing wrong with black children. Okay? We need to stop trying to fix disenfranchised black children and start fixing those things that are disenfranchising black students. Okay? So today, I want to highlight the challenges, acknowledge progress made, and discuss how we can push forward to meaningful change. Some of the challenges. Black students are less likely to participate in advanced courses like advanced placement, gifted and talented, programs like that. They are disproportionately placed in special education. Additionally, black students often face disproportionate discipline actions. Research reveals that they are more likely to be suspended and expelled than their white peers for the same behaviors. And I'm blessed to get to go around the country and talk to schools and school districts and also here in the Commonwealth. And when I'm talking about school climate and discipline and things of that nature, I always ask the principals to look at their discipline data just as much as their achievement data. Because there's a correlation. If you're not in the building, you're probably not learning, right? And if you look at schools that have a significant number of black children in our schools in Kentucky, they tend to get suspended for what we call subjective reasons. Disrespect, insubordination. These are questionable, but their white counterparts, usually middle-class students, tend to get suspended for objective reasons, fights, drugs, weapons. And so when our students are out of school, they're missing instructional time. This not only disrupts their learning, but contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline, where discipline policies push students out of the educational spaces and into the criminal justice system. Representation matters. When black students rarely see teachers or administrators who look like them, it can affect their sense of belonging and the way they engage within education. Studies have shown that black students who have at least one black teacher are more likely to graduate and consider going into higher education. Yet, black educators still remain underrepresented. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress and the National Center for Educational Statistics, so to make sure we're not making this up, okay? In 2024, black students had an average score that was 25 points lower than that of their white students overall in student achievement. This performance gap was not significantly different from that of 1998 when it was only 21 points. So almost 50 years, only a 4-point difference. If we take a deeper look at our state assessment, in the early 90s it was called CARIS. Through the late 90s and through the 2000s, middle 2000s, it was called CATS, and now it's called the KSA. The data has not changed much. Overall, students have improved, all students, but the gap remains the same. In some cases, it's even worsened for black students. This information right here is kind of alarming. I haven't looked at it in a while. If we look at the ACT scores in 2014, white students' composite ACT score was 20.5, and black students' composite score was 16.8. 2014. 9 years later, post-pandemic, the composite score for white students was 19.4 and black students 15.8. But I will make a point right here that all students' ACT score dropped during the pandemic, okay? But here's the thing. In 2019, before the pandemic, black students' composite score was 16.7. It was lower than it was in 2014. And I'll remind you that the benchmarks for college readiness is 18 in English, 19 in math, and 20 in reading. And so our students in 2024, black students, are not hitting any of the benchmarks on average. The other piece that's important, if we disaggregate the data to be gender specific, I can almost guarantee you that more than likely African American students, regardless whether they're in special ed or poor, is going to be lower than 16 points on the ACT. And when you start thinking 4 or 5 points on ACT, that's a lot of information. That's a big gap. But there is some progress, okay? Despite all the challenges, there are some bright spots. There are more black students attending college in Kentucky. While there are gaps in graduation and retention rates between blacks and white students, those gaps have decreased over the years. You can almost infer that if we can just get them out of high school, they tend to do okay in college if we can get them out of high school. In Kentucky, there's been a 13.3% increase in credentials awarded to underrepresented minority students. Okay, we have to kind of pull that out to find our black students because they say underrepresented minority students. We know the largest percentage of those students are black. A 6.9% increase in bachelor's degrees awarded to underrepresented minority students in our public universities. An 11.7% increase in graduate degrees awarded to underrepresented minority students. So there's some progress being made. We know there's been progress since board, but it also shows you we have a lot of work to do for our students in education. And most of my focus has been on K-12. So what do we do for the path forward? Change requires collective effort. Educators, policymakers, parents, students themselves all have a role to play. We must listen to black students about their experiences and ensure they feel seen, heard, empowered in their learning environments. I tell students all the time. I work with a program in Lexington called BMW Academy. We've been working with African American males since 2005 to focus on student achievement and leadership. And I tell our students all the time that if it's about you, without you, then it's not for you. You give them voice and choice. We should make policy we have not talking to students. The status of black students' educational experience is not just an issue for black communities. It's a matter of justice, progress, and the future of our country, our commonwealth, our county, and even your corner. An investment in black students is an investment in a stronger, a more equitable future for all students. So let us commit to not just acknowledge these disparities, but actually work to dismantle them. Because when every student, regardless of race, has an opportunity to learn and grow, we all win. As I said before, there are several things to consider supporting blacks in education, particularly our children. Family and community engagement is really important. Safer schools are important. You mentioned mental health, okay? Dealing with trauma, okay? We have vicarious trauma. It may not happen to you, but it happens to your family. Children take that to school. More teachers of color, small class sizes, preschool, all those things. I didn't mention your jam, my bad. I can't mention all of them, okay? But there's a lot of things we all can do, right? So here's a couple of recommendations, okay? I'm following my task I got from the senator. Educators, you're an educator right now, ask yourselves who feels comfortable and safe in your school and who feels uncomfortable and unsafe in your school. Community stakeholders and organizations, ask yourselves this: is your community service aligned with the needs of schools? Okay. Are they consistent and are they systemic if we're going to volunteer in our schools? And the last recommendation is for our policymakers. I would suggest if you're a policymaker, you don't have one of these, create a policy impact assessment, okay? And ask yourself when you're developing policy, which student group or groups may be most affected by a new policy in schools? What adverse impacts or unintended consequences could result from this policy? Which student groups could be negatively affected from that policy? How could adverse impacts be prevented or minimized from that policy? Is your policy fair, just, applicable, and accessible for students and families? In this case, for Black families. Does it remove systemic barriers to learning? And have you spoken to a diverse audience, particularly students, to get their perspectives? At the end of the day, Black students, and all students for that matter, are not going to be successful unless they have an equitable education. And equitable education is about access, about meeting students' needs, and it's about justice, okay? And every student needs that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for those presentations. Does everyone have a card in here that was handed out in case you have questions? If you have questions, someone will be around somewhere to collect those cards. They'll get those to me. Right now, I want to focus in on what has been presented, see if we can expand on it a little bit. So I'm looking at this, the comments last made regarding education. Preceding that, we dealt with questions of health related to environment, for instance, economics. We look at the historical piece. Here's the question I have. What of those factors, and anyone can grab this from wherever their perspective is on this, or their presentation may have been, what specifically, from a policy standpoint, needs to be done to increase better outcomes of African American students, notwithstanding these other factors of health, environment, et cetera? Who wants to try that?
In reference to policy for students, and in this case, Black students, I know we have some policies right now that's been introduced, right, from the House and the Senate. And you can't really have a debate about educational policies unless we have common language. And so if I asked everyone in this room how they define equity, particularly education equity, there's no telling how many different definitions I would get. And so, as I said before, it's about access, it's about fairness, it's about justice. Equity is the process, equality is the outcome. Y'all know that was dope. But anyway, in other words, if we don't give her an equitable education and addressing her needs from kindergarten to 12th grade, the chances of her having an equal opportunity, equal outcomes to someone else who got the things they needed are slim. So having common language, what equity actually is, I can have the debate with someone, or it's an educator, a policymaker, whoever, if we're saying equity is one thing. Equity and equal are not the same thing. Equal is the desired outcome. Okay. So I would want policies to make sure that we understand that we look through everything through an equity lens.
Let me dig into that just a little bit. So are you saying, or how do you deal with the needs of students? They have different needs. So that suggests that that has to be met with different types of resources, different types.
Real quickly, historically, I think as in 1972, we had the Title IX legislation. And that dealt with sex discrimination and gender equity. 1975, we had IDEA for special education students, okay? They need a different approach to address their needs in schools. That was instructional equity. In 1990, over 50-something school districts sued the state of Kentucky because of inequitable funding, because the schools in Eastern Kentucky didn't have the tax base to provide the same kind of education that Fayette County and Jefferson County had. So we changed the entire educational system on an equity issue. So if we can understand equity from gender, economics, okay, instruction, why can't we understand it through race? That's my point.
Wow, you jumped ahead, and that's where I was headed. Anyone else want to jump in on that, please? Microphone.
Test. So a very simple policy change is compensation for teachers. And I understand, so I'm in college teaching. First of all, that's how my brain works in the classroom. But secondly, it's because at least I get paid a living wage working in a university. And teachers are squeezed from many sides financially. I actually, as a historian, I'm educating some social studies teachers. And they are, they're very idealistic, but they need a way to hold body and soul together as they are in these classrooms. And we need to increase the quality of teaching so that when students get to my classroom in college, they truly are ready. I am seeing some deep lack of readiness across the color line, and teacher minimum salaries are going to raise the tide for everybody. So sometimes Black people are the canaries in the coal mines. So we're seeing this effect on Black children, but actually it is a benefit to everybody to have higher quality teaching and investing more in our school systems.
Dr. Benitez?
An economist, I think about markets, but I also think about competition and being competitive. And for a lot of the places, you mentioned before about not having the tax base to be able to make the same types of investments. But if you want to curb things that we care about, such as teacher retention and turnover, and you not only have to recruit good teachers, but you have to incentivize them to stay. You have to give them not only a salary that is competitive, not just in Kentucky, but it's not just that they're considering other jobs in Kentucky. They consider other jobs in other states beyond the Commonwealth. So curbing voluntary teacher turnover. Many of our underserved schools have probably a bimodal distribution of teachers there's teachers who are near retirement and teachers who just started their careers in teaching, but not a whole lot of teachers who are in the middle with middle levels of experience and tenure in the education system. So one key thing is to, especially in thinking about equity in many of our Eastern Kentucky underserved communities and other parts of the Commonwealth. So think about the challenges that many of these teachers will have to face in trying to bring up the students who are already there, who are already living in adverse social determinants. There's only but so much they can do when in the classroom, when a child has to go back home to a place where they don't have adequate resources, they have difficulty eating like they should be. So if you want more out of education, you have to adequately invest in people who are going to be the educators. And
Talking about educators, but go a little deeper in that last point you was making. You was talking about where you find the student, where the student comes from. They also have an economic reality. Yes. Would you expound on that?
okay, so students are coming from communities where there's only but so much investments their home or their families can make in them. So if they're poor, if they're in isolated communities in Eastern Kentucky or outside the Golden Triangle, outside of Northern Kentucky, outside of Lexington, outside of Louisville, there's only but so much opportunity to access resources and get exposed to ideas and even possibilities. So even thinking about what types of investments so that people can, students, especially when they're young, can see a future. That requires some sort of investment using public resources, because otherwise it's not going to just happen out of thin air. It's not going to just happen on its own. So that's.
Please, Dr. Kerwood.
Is this okay? Great. So oftentimes, the environmental health sector and the education sector are siloed from each other. But doing any of these in a silo doesn't help. So I certainly recommend having multidisciplinary areas of expertise coming together to protect schools and our students and our communities all the same. I think one of the most important things to support that is the need of having local data. There's much national data that can be helpful, but really what we experience in our communities takes place locally. So ensuring that we have local data and an abundance of it is critical. And then working in multidisciplinary groups to be able to do that. And then there are some resources that I want to point out. There are some groups that work on what lead in water pipes. So working to replace lead in water pipes, but making sure that there's not lead in the water of school students, being that school students are uniquely susceptible when it comes to that. There are some groups that also consider the cleaning products that are in our classrooms to ensure that they are safe and that they are healthy and effective, but they also do not put off more volatile organic compounds or other things that could be hazardous for people who still have developing organ systems or young children, for example. So I think that might be called a Safe and Healthy Schools Coalition. Don't mark my words exactly, but that should lead you in the right direction if you're looking for resources in that direction as well. So I definitely recommend having interdisciplinary groups to come together to bring multiple forms of expertise, but also to have the lived expertise of the people that live and breathe in these places as well to help inform that unique expertise as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So what strategies can schools and universities implement to combat the racial achievement gap and ensure equitable access to educational resources? What strategies institutionally can be undertaken?
As I said before, I think you can't make policies and implement practices without common language. And so it leads me back to this conversation about equity. So imagine all of us are in the middle of the ocean. We're all in the middle of an ocean in the midst of a storm. And the storm is made up of post-pandemic health issues, which impacts economics, the political climate, economic strain, and trauma. That's the storm. Sound familiar? That's the storm. And we're all in the middle of the ocean together. And even though we're all in the ocean together, we are situated differently in that storm. So you may have to be in a huge ocean liner. So you're feeling the storm, but you're not feeling that bad. Man, way in the back, you're on a yacht, so you're feeling it worse than he is. You're in a rowboat, so you're really feeling it. You're on a life raft, and my sister here is on a life preserver. And even though we're all in the same storm, we are situated differently. And you can't use universal strategies for different situations. So we have to teach our educators and us professors, okay, to help prepare our teachers, because regardless what the demographics looks like in our classroom, our teachers, after coming out of university, should be able to teach whoever is in our classrooms. And that's part of the problem. They're not prepared they can either do special ed, or they can do general ed, or I can do well in an urban school in Jefferson County, but I can't really go to teach in Lawrence County, those kinds of things. So going back to that common language and then also defining what success looks like for students is critical for that also. And because as soon as you say equity, we equate it to black or race. And I've been doing this stuff around equity for the last 20 years, from Paducah to Pikeville, from Cumberland to Covington. And I did a training on equity in Fallsburg Elementary in Lawrence County. And the principal was like, "What are you doing here? We don't have any black students." And I said, "But you have kids who are poor, affluent, boys, girls, special ed, non-special ed. All those touch on equity, okay? And so until we have those common languages, we're going to struggle developing great policy and also even questioning policy because you don't know what it means." And so all those things, whether it's a school teacher, whether it's a superintendent, whether it's professors, whoever it is, or people in the community, have to be on the same page with what we're talking about.
So while we're on that, would you explain what the value, well, first of all, what is culturally responsive teaching? And where does that fit in the overall teaching process?
All right, I'm going to charge you now, Senator. No, I'm just kidding. First of all, culturally responsive teaching is not just for black students. Culturally responsive teaching is using children's experiences in their community and connecting that to content, okay? And it's not only K-12, it's universities also. I was having this conversation with one of the universities I worked in. I was having a conversation with one of the white professors. And we're on, friends, we know each other's families and things of that nature. And I was talking to him about culturally responsive teaching, connecting content to students' backgrounds. And he was like, "Well, it's important, but it's not that important." And I said, "Well, let me put it where you can get it. Both our sons are entering the same university in the fall. And I said, when your son walks into his first class at that university, his culture is part of the curriculum, and my son's culture is an elective. That's why you need to be culturally responsive. I can be culturally responsive in Inez, Kentucky, and Martin County just as quickly as I can be in Covington or Jefferson or Fayette. So it's for all children. The part of the issue is that a lot of times in our schools, they cannot relate to African American culture. And so we have to help them do that and make sense and make that, because people connect what they don't know to what they do know. And the only thing you can fall back on is your past experiences, which is different cultures. People teach in Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, they talk about place, because place is important in Appalachia. And place is important also in African American culture also. So basically the bottom line is using students' cultural experiences to connect to content, and so they can apply those strategies that teachers are trying to teach them. That's the down and dirty of it.
So let's shift this a little bit. Students come from somewhere. They live somewhere. They are surrounded by something. We're talking about environment. We're talking about access. We're talking about economics, I think, with respect to that particular piece. Would you speak to that? Would you speak to what is it that has to be done with respect to environment that would improve a student's opportunity to succeed educationally, for instance? And related to that, of course, is health and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So we need, on the one hand, let me take a step back. Our environment is everything around us. It's the air, it's the water that we breathe, it is the spaces where we're sitting in the communities with the sidewalks, et cetera. All of that contributes to our environment. And our environment can be helpful to our health, and then there are also factors in our environment that can be harmful to our health. So understanding the factor that affect school children, students in schools, that can be harmful to our health, we need to work to address and eliminate those and mitigate any risk with those. So that could be hazardous emissions, that could be in close proximity to roadways, and what can we do about the emissions that come from those types of exposures. That could be lead in water, so replacing lead service lines, for example. So those are some things that can be done to protect the health of students. But then there are also protective factors in the environment. I mentioned that We tend to live in communities that are redlined. Our redlined communities tend to have lower tree cover. So is that a reasonable option that could actually benefit health, benefit the environment, and benefit our communities and our community cohesiveness, like tree planting, increasing tree canopy, or increasing access to green spaces? So there are a number of things that can be done. Again, I say the data helps to support the need for the actions. The absence of data doesn't mean that there's an absence of an issue or an absence of a good solution. So we don't want to be under the paralysis of analysis, but there are some useful solutions that do exist that can be beneficial to our community that may be a little bit outside the box, for example, like tree planting. Thanks for this question.
Well, we're getting pretty close to the end of our opportunity here. So, first of all, I want to thank you all for this, and I want everyone here to understand, and those who have an opportunity to look at recordings of this, that this sort of frames the challenge. Can't do it in this short period of time. It's going to take a process. It's going to take some in-depth investigation. It's going to be a period of education for a larger community, but more specifically policyholders, at least in my mind. But I think the larger community as well are very important in this. One of the things I want to keep everyone to keep in mind here is that this is a platform for the next step. And the next step is about undertaking that research and that investigation, centralizing it, making sure it's targeted to those who make decisions that affect our lives, and continuing this discussion, but doing it with validated information that's data-driven so that it benefits all that makes decisions with respect to the subject matter that we engage in. What I'd like to do is thank Kentucky State University for providing this technical assistance here today. That's very important. I don't think the way we're set up here, we're not technologically versatile to adapt to this environment without that assistance. Also, I want to thank the individuals that helped pull this piece together. I want to thank LRC, the Legislative Research Commission, in particular as it relates to Mike Wynn and Leslie Cottle, who specifically did so much work that you didn't see or didn't hear. It's a lot to put something like this together. But here's what I really want you to understand. I want you to understand that the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus is engaged in a process of trying to inform a multifaceted, multi-layered community so it can dig itself out of the fear and or the reality of reaction that takes us nowhere. It divides us. And we are of the mind that you have to take in the pleasant with the unpleasant with an attitude of trying to solve problems for all people, leaving no one out, to uplift communities, Kentucky, the nation, et cetera, et cetera. That is our spirit that we enter into this, and we invite you all to engage this going into the future. So I want to thank our panelists today. This is an inaugural opportunity for us to undertake this. You are part of this. We invite you into this. We invite you to reach out and join us with respect to this, because we think and we know that there's really nothing new under the sun. This is about solutions. It's about priorities. It's about making the investment in our young people, and our young people, they are our future. So we must lift everyone, and policymakers here have a responsibility to do that. You notice I didn't get into a big discussion about the so-called DEI. Let me just say this, because I think it's very important for us to understand. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to leave you with this. Keep in mind that a lot of this conversation that's taking place is intentionally distractive. And it's not founded on firm, in my view, intention or factual basis. What we're trying to do here is to say to those folks and to those folks who do not understand, take your time, understand what the facts are, and let's discuss these, find solutions together to overcome what we all espouse to do. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our chairman, George Brown, who has given us great leadership in the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus. But most of all, I want to thank you for being here and for coming with respect. Pardon?
May I have a word?
Of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all to this panel. This panel was awesome, and they brought a wealth of knowledge. We're 15 days into the session, a 30-day session. We've got 15 days left. I would certainly love to have you all come back for the hearings that we're going to have on DEI. And it is important that we make sure that intelligent folk like you with the data can speak to the issues that I may come off emotionally, but we need your and your colleagues' expertise to bring to the discussion, because it seems very small. Well, it is very small where we are in terms of the discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you all, and look to our offices and Senator Neal's office as we continue to have conversations. House Bill 4 is the DEI bill in the House, and then there's Senate Bill 164.
Okay, thank you. Now, we also have another step to this. This is the fourth iteration. It would have been the fourth, but it's the third now. You have a flyer here. We would invite all of you all to participate in this. This is the piece that we spoke about earlier between the Kentucky Historical Society and the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus, and its emphasis is on the black workers' quest for the American dream, workers' rights, and unionism. You ought to attend this. This is a good one. This is going to be at the Thomas D. Clark Center for Kentucky History here in Frankfort. Again, thank you very much, and good evening. Good afternoon.